drinking some water. Okay, tonight's presentation, you'll see, is entitled The North China Marines. The North China Marines was a military company size, about 200 plus people that were essentially the American Embassy Guard unit in Peking, China. So they had the embassy in Peking, there was a consulate in Tianjin, and then they had a warehouse in Qinglingtao. And I'll get maps up and show the relationship of all these, and we'll talk about it. But Dad was part of that group. Interestingly enough, the last of the North China Marines died in January last year at age 100. So, pretty hardy group. Okay, so about 2 years back, I looked it up the other night, 2 years ago, the 24th, which is 2 days from now, one of our members, Rod Fink, did a presentation, and we were just beginning the Zoom world, and Rod did a presentation about his experiences in Vietnam, entitled The Three Wars. And so after he was done, and Rod was a Navy corpsman, and after the presentation, I sent him an email and complimented him on the presentation, and gave him a brief glimpse of my dad's experiences. And Rod said right away, "Dick, you've got to tell Dad's story. You've just got to tell Dad's story." So here we are. All right. Some brief history of the area and the Marines and the embassy in Peking, China. And oh, by the way, when Dad was there were two ways to spell Peking, P-E-K-I-N-G, and Peiping, P-E-I-P-I-N-G. Today it's called Beijing, begins with a B. So I'm going to call it Peking. That's what it was when Dad was there. Okay. All right, so as early as the 1900s, 1890s actually, early Boxer Rebellion activity in China, the Marines came in to help protect the American citizens that lived there, American businesses that were in operation in Peking. The Boxer Rebellion was a cult of Chinese. In fact, they called themselves the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, hence the name Boxer. So they were anti-foreigner, anti-American, anti-Chinese Christians. They were a pretty rabble-rousing kind of group, and were a real problem for a while. But anyway, the Marines were beefed up and started a higher presence starting in the 1900s, about the time of the Boxer Rebellion. So the presence continued in China through the 20s and the 30s. Also, there was an army unit that was in Shanghai and a few places other than that until 1938. So we had a military presence in China on the mainland, pretty heavy presence until 38. Now, most of the embassies were in a walled portion of the city of Peking. Most of the major embassies were in a walled-off area that had gates, but nonetheless, they were not part of the city proper. So by 1938, Japan had a pretty good grip on China. Many people may not realize that Japan had invaded Korea in 1910 and had been occupying Korea from 1910 until after the war, basically. They were after natural resources and etc. So it was an easy thing for them in 1937 to go up through Manchuria and down into the eastern part of China, where Peking, Tianjin, some of the bigger suburban areas, and then down into Shanghai. So they were after the coastal area, which is where the majority of the people were. The areas to the east, or to the west, excuse me. So there's Korea, and there's Manchuria, and then they came down and took most of the Peking area. Here's Shanghai, and they very quickly took in the rest of it. So they were heavily interested in the coastal area because that's where most of the people were. The rest of the area was farming and etc. So the tensions were beginning to build in China, and I think American embassy people realized that the saber rattling was getting pretty serious. So the Army's 15th Regiment left Shanghai. The Marines assumed some additional duties in Tianjin, and Tianjin was a consulate office, which is like an outpost of the embassy. They can do visa work and passport kind of things. And there was a small portion of the Marines that were there. So it was becoming pretty evident, and there was a lot of consolidation efforts going on in China amongst the American troops. American embassy, they were beginning to send home non-essential civilians, just minimizing their staff and their exposure. So this is about the time that Dad comes into the picture. In 1939, we were in Bremerton, Washington. That was Dad's post at that point. And he got orders to come to San Diego and go to Fleet Marine Force training. That's where they take Navy corpsmen and teach them how to be Marines. And so he finished his Fleet Marine Force training and suddenly was on his way to China. Well, it just so happens that he arrived the day that they were taking a group picture and he hadn't received his Marine Greens. So guess who Dad is? God. And what's interesting is that picture is on the North China Marines website. If you want to spend a whole day reading on a website, go to northchinamarines.com, and there's more material there than you would ever want to know. Okay. All right. So let's look at where things were. This is, in 1940, the stations were, this map says Beijing, but that's Peking. Qinghuantao is a deep water port on the Sea of Japan there, or the sea in between, North China Sea in between China and Korea. And then Tianjin is about where the sea is in Qinghuantao. And then Shanghai, you can see, is quite a ways south. So, in addition to the Marine Embassy Guard Unit, there was a regiment of Marines in Shanghai of 1,200 men. And so that's where we were in 1940. Here's a picture taken in November of 41, so we're about a month away from the war starting. This is all the non-commissioned officers, and Dad is the first row left corner. All the non-commissioned officers have been shown. Now I'm going to show you this winter cap that may not make a lot of sense. Later on I'll show you a picture that it'll make more sense as to why I'm showing it to you now. It was cold in North China. It gets cold and wintry and pretty nasty. So if anybody in the audience has been a Marine, this was legitimate headwear in Peking, China. Dad made it home with his. I have no idea what happened to it. He made it home with a lot of stuff, which I'll be covering before the evening's over, but something has happened to his fur cap. So anyway, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay. Let me get myself caught up with my notes here. Okay, enter the President Harrison. The President Harrison was part of the Merchant Marine fleet of President lines. And the President lines in the 20s and 30s, if you stop and think about it, there wasn't a lot of high volume air traffic to get places in the world like there is today. So a lot of people took the boat, took a ship. If you were going to Seattle, you'd choose places with a train or get on a ship. And so the President lines had international cruise ships by their standards in those days. They had first-class cabins and etc. And some of their ships were cargo only, but a number of them, including the Harrison, had facilities for hauling a fair number of passengers. Now, it had been recently converted to be a troop carrier. Let's stop and think about that. Somebody months earlier, in a position to do something about it, thought things were getting serious enough to contract or whatever with the Merchant Marines to get the Harrison converted to be a troop carrier. My sense is they probably took out all the first-class cabins and made it pretty bare and took fancy chairs out and things like that. So it became an interesting part of the story. The Merchant Marines in those days called their captains a master. So the master of the Harrison was a man by the name of Oral Pearson. And interestingly enough, if you want some more reading on the internet, Oral Pearson's full written report on what happened, and I'm going to be telling you about it here in a minute, is available online, and it's interesting reading. Just Google SS President Harrison Merchant Marine or something like that, and you'll get it up, and it's a very interesting reading. Okay, so in November of 1941. Now, one of the things I want to give you a heads up on, because I might start mixing things up here. Honolulu is on the other side of the international date line. So December 7th at 8 o'clock in the morning, on that Sunday morning when the attack started on Honolulu, they're 18 hours ahead in East China. So it was 2 o'clock in the morning on the 8th. So the 4th Marines had been taken from Shanghai and moved down to the Philippines by the SS President Harrison. And their next mission was to go get the last of the Marines, which was to get up to Chinwangtao and get the embassy group out. They were scheduled to arrive up there on the 13th of December. And so the embassy people had been packing and crating all non-essential equipment, files, etc. They'd sent home a lot of stuff. They'd already shipped it home. So on the morning of December 4th, the Harrison had dropped off the Shanghai Marines in the Philippines, and on December 4th was heading north. On the morning of December 8th, now this was 18 hours ahead, so it was that morning, the Harrison was in this area right opposite the mouth of the Yangtze River, opposite Shanghai. And the people on watch in the steerage, the wheelhouse, always kept shortwave radios on to listen to what was going on, especially at that period in time. And they started hearing chatter on the radio about the bombing taking place in Pearl Harbor. So Master Pearson obviously woke up, came to the wheelhouse, and he made a statement to the crew, "I'm not going to surrender the ship," period. Apparently, he was there when the keel for the Harrison was laid, and he said that ship is so sturdy is all we would do would be to dent anything we hit. So anyway, the decision was made that they were not going to surrender the ship. So he knew that there was this Shan Island is a major lighthouse out there, communication center for the Navy, for the ships. So he did a hard starboard to the right turn and headed toward that island. He was bound determined to keep the ship from being easily taken by the Japanese. Well, they saw what he was doing, but they didn't want to damage or destroy the ship, so they just fired warning rounds, airplanes coming over and firing warning rounds at the ship, chasing the ship with Japanese destroyers, which are much faster than the President Harrison was. And but he knew that he needed to hit the island with a glancing blow to try to rip open the side of the ship and do as much damage as he could, because he knew he couldn't hit it straight on with the Harrison. So anyway, that's what they did. Let me check my notes here. So he had a crew of 153, and what I found interesting is he had a crew of 153, one of which was a female stewardess. But anyway, the crews got alerted. They knew what they had to do if they hit the ship and went aground. Most of them got into lifeboats, and he released them off the side before he hit the island. The majority of the crew was in lifeboats. They hit the island, and he did a fair amount of damage to the port side. What was kind of funny when you stop and think about it, is that the Chinese who ran the lighthouse, they had no knowledge of any of this that was going on. They were Chinese nationals, and they were having a good time running this lighthouse. Well, so they got all the food ready. They put on a feed. They were going to feed these sudden visitors that they had until the Japanese landing party got there. So anyway, the merchant marine ship Harrison was taken prisoner. The Japanese managed to take the ship, and but they had to do a lot of work before they could use it for their own good. So. Okay, so December 8th, once again in Peking. In anticipating their move, they, like I said, virtually everything was crated, all of their equipment, all of their ammunition, most of their guns, other than a couple of sidearms and maybe a rifle or two, and that was it. Early in the morning, they were surrounded, and there was a total of 203 men, 140 in Peking, 48 in Tianjin, and 15 in Qinhuangdao at the warehouse area. Now, one of the things that my dad was known for was he was an inveterate note taker. He would write on scribbles of paper and keep them. Remember the old-fashioned calendars? You flip over the pages? Dad wrote notes from December 1 through December 10. And I'm going to read you December 8th, the morning that this happened. The others are interesting, but this is kind of poignant. Went to Chow and was told we were surrounded by Japanese troops. Radio said war declared. Japan on U.S. 140 men here with guns of guard and very little ammunition. All records burned. Colonel Ashurst took white flag to Japanese embassy, surrendering the post without a shot fired. The Japanese took our compound, and Old Glory was lowered at 2:45 p.m. All firearms checked and taken out. Tension and uncertainty run high. Toast by the hospital core group with black label to stick together. Those of you that may know what black label is. The next day, December 9th, had several bed checks throughout the night. The junior officers are very rebellious and indignant. Still don't know where we'll stay. Hall, who is the chief of his section, Hall was assured we'll stay in hospital as we're non-combatants, but damn loyal Americans. Meals irregular. Chow about the same, little sleep. All men's lockers sealed, but hospital core. Japanese started rolling all government equipment out to meet our transport. Later, when we're finished, I've got those. I'm in a plastic bag, but if you'd like to take a look at them, they're interesting. The other thing I've got is Dad's handwritten roster with all of the guys in his section signed, autographed, and it was Barracks 6, Section 3. There was 36 men in that section. They all had to learn how to count off in Japanese as part of the morning roll call, if you will. And Dad was number 12, which is junior.
How old is Dad?
Dad was born in '04. So when the war broke out, he was, what, 37 years old. Okay. And he'd been in the Navy for 12 years at that point. Okay. Okay. Here is probably the most poignant picture you'll never see another copy of. It is in the National Archives, but what I mean by another copy, another instance of this kind of thing. Colonel Ashurst, with his guidon, has a white flag, surrendering at the Japanese embassy. Now that's pretty poignant. What's interesting, our company size, the size of the group of the men at the embassy, 203 men typically in a Marine company would not have a full colonel as the commanding officer. But because it was an embassy and the nature of the visitors that they had sometimes, including military visitors that were very cognizant of rank, a full colonel did them a lot of good. Okay, and you'll see as the story goes along, it does them some more good later on. This particular picture is in the National Archives. A few weeks later, there was a meeting, and you can see that there's some Japanese, and then they're surrounded by a number of allies. Colonel Ashurst is right there. I think that's a British officer. Major Brown, who was the executive officer of the embassy of Marine, North China Marines, and then various people from British and French and other places where they have quickly taken prisoners surrounding this meeting. But the key point is that Colonel Ashurst was told and surrendered thinking that the protocol that had been established, that embassy guards would be treated as the embassy civilian personnel in terms of being repatriated in the event of a war. And in this particular case, the Japanese chose not to honor that. Okay, so right away they were confined to the quarters at the embassy, and the ones in Tin Sin were confined to their quarters, etc. The 15 Marines in Qingguangtao came down to Tin Sin and were kept there in confined to quarters. And they spent almost then the rest of the embassy people were taken over to Tin Sin, and they spent almost a month there, from the 26th until late January. So on the late January of 42, they were all loaded on railroad boxcars and taken out. And this is a picture of them being marched through Tin Sin to the railroad station to go to the camp they were going to, the Wusong Forts. And you can see the Marines all have those fur caps on. The Japanese are the ones that have the long rifles. And so here they're marching the group of captured North China Marines to the railroad station. And once again, this is another National Archives photo. Okay, let's quickly review where the camps were, especially on the mainland of China, and then we'll come back to this thing later on. You can see that up here is Peking, Qingguangtao, and Tin Sin, and then just outside of Peking is Fengtai, which is a camp that will come into play later in the story. Down near Shanghai, there were two camps and a jail. Wusong Forts was previously a nationalist Chinese army base. So Chiang Kai-shek had built a pretty good sized army base there, and then as his efforts to resist the Japanese and Mao Zedong and the communists that were rattling sabers and causing problems, he had to abandon that, but he surrendered it or abandoned it, I guess would be a better word, and the Japanese took it over and turned it into a POW camp. Down here also, Ward Road Jail, and that was apparently in English what it was called, Ward Road Jail. Even the Chinese knew what a Ward Road Jail was. That's where the people that had attempted escapes or the serious discipline problems were taken and treated a little bit more roughly. Okay, so we'll get into some of the escape attempts, etc. But Ward Road Jail was not a good place. You he didn't want to go there if he didn't have to be. Okay, here's a map of Wusong Forts. And the North China Marines were there from February through November of 1942. So they came by train in boxcars in late January, early February. This was a fairly large camp. Over the first few months, as things developed in the South Pacific, the camp would swell from 1,200 to 1,800 men in a camp that wasn't designed for that many. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things that I think is incredibly interesting, and probably because there was a full colonel in charge of the North China Marines. Colonel Ashurst and the doctor, Dr. Foley, convinced the camp commander of the wisdom of keeping the medical group together. They had 2 doctors, a dentist, and 11 corpsmen that were either dental aides or corpsmen medics, Navy medics. And for the most part, that just became routine and was honored for the most part for quite the 2-3 years. So the medical group was pretty much together. One of the things that in my research, I ran across an old Army Times magazine issue, and one of the articles was the Army was crowing that they had, as they were leaving, that they had given their X-ray machine to the Marines. Well, it turns out whether or not the X-ray machine was one that was at the embassy and got transported down or came from this exchange earlier. But Dad was a certified X-ray tech. By the time the war started, he'd been in the Navy for 12, almost 13 years. He'd been to every school he could get. He was an X-ray tech. And turns out that they had the equipment, they had film, and they had chemicals. Now, those of you that have been around old-fashioned film work, where you have to have a tray for developer and a stop bath and the fixer and the wash and all that kind of stuff, and those chemicals will deteriorate rapidly when exposed to the air. So you have to, if you mix up a batch, you better take real good care of it real quick. You know, have an extra jar to put them in because it's been mixed with water. So somehow they made it all last, and there's more to the story here in a few minutes. They gradually began to lose a few of the regular Marines would be hand-picked occasionally, and it turns out that some of it seems to have been taking people of smaller stature to take them to the island of Japan to work in coal mines. Because the Japanese industry was hurting bad for energy. They didn't have people to work the coal mines like they wanted. So there were a few of the younger, smaller stature folks that got taken and handpicked and sent to work to Japan to work in coal mines. Okay, so in December of '42, so here we are, almost 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had built a new camp not too far away from Wusong Forts. And the nice thing about it was new construction. It wasn't luxurious, but it was new. the big thing was it was on higher ground, better drainage, and not near the mud hole that the Wusong Forts was in the rainy season. So they were thankful for that. At King One, they had a small patch of area that they could use as a garden. If they could get seeds mailed from home, they could raise things. Dad and some of his friends used to, when they got together, you could hear them laughing and slapping their knees, remembering an instance when one of the Marines who was a young Hispanic kid from Texas got his mother to send him seeds of some jalapeno seeds. And he got a nice crop of jalapenos one season. And while he was out tending them one day, one of the guards came up and motioned that he was curious about what was going on. So he picked a nice ripe one and handed it to him. Well, he took one and chewed right into it, you know. Well, the guard, needless to say, took off running for water. And Dad and the guys would retell that story and laugh and slap their knees. At King Juan, they also occasionally would find out that certain people had been either radio techs or mechanics, you know, wheeled vehicle or tracked vehicle mechanics, and would put them to work in shops. And any tools they had to check in and check out and make sure they didn't leave at the end of the day with anything sharp. They had a tailor shop. They had a shoe repair shop to keep their moccasins or whatever they had on their feet together. But once again, any sharp instruments like awls had to be turned in at the end of the day, and they only were issued one. So they weren't able to do a lot of high volume work. At King Juan, they had the medics had a full-blown sick bay area. They, as part of taking care of their own sick, and as well as any other allies that were in the camp that needed medical attention, and there were some things that had to be done once in a while, you know, medically. Especially, you know, probably the worst part was that any lashings or beatings or things like that wasn't real heavily common, but it was if somebody mouthed off or was a little bit too slow doing a task, and etc. So if you kept your mouth shut, you probably didn't get beat too badly. So once again, they had 3 officers and 11 enlisted in the medical unit. Okay, the X-ray machine comes back into play. Dad managed to keep every X-ray film that he took. Now, I think there was only like 25, somewhere 25, 28, somewhere in the 20s. But he kept them and a log of who it was, their military service number, you know, X-ray, left tibia or whatever, the occasion of the injury that caused him to do the X-ray. So he kept that log, kept the films all through his interment time, and made it home with him. After he got home, he took, after his rest time, etc., when his first assignment was in San Diego. So he took his films in, sat down and wrote out a lengthy report. And remember the old onion skin duplicate copies? You know? Somewhere along the line, the onion skin was in amongst our stuff, and I have no idea where it is. Somewhere it's got lost or got mixed into some of Mom's things. I don't know. But it was a long letter from him describing the nature of the log and the films and the circumstances that they were taken in, and sent them to the Navy Medical Records Bureau in Washington, D.C. to be merged into the individual military person's medical files. And he ended up receiving a special commendation for that. Okay, here's a drawing that was done by one of the POWs after he returned home. So he did this from memory. And he made some other drawings, but this particular one was kind of indicative to me of just a glimpse of the buildings and the fence. Now the fences were electrified, and there were a couple of Marines that thought they could get through that electric fence, and they didn't. So they had a couple of them died trying to get out and get through the electric fence. Dad said that the treatment that they had, that they got worse as the war went along. Now, part of that was the rotation of troops off of the front lines, the embattled young bucks that were just brought back to heal up a wound or something like that. But with the rotation of Japanese troops coming back to become guards, they were much meaner and nastier than the ones they had early on. Now, one of their interpreters in this camp, his last name was Ishihawa. He got the title of the Beast of the East. He was brutal. He just was downright nasty. Spoke perfect English. Been educated in the U.S., but he had some hatred that you couldn't believe. He was captured and stood trial in the war crimes trials following the war, sentenced to life, and he did die in prison in 1966 for his conduct. And the medics were, constantly, as you can imagine, constantly working and preaching about cleanliness and doing everything they could to have as good an environment as possible. Some of the problems that they had, staff-wise, a lot of dysentery, as you can imagine. That was common. Many of the Marines, including Dad, had contracted malaria from other assignments in the South Pacific. Then, of course, any wounds or things that needed to be treated from beatings and et cetera. So the medical group had their hands full with very little other than they had the scalpels and the tools, and Dennis had his tools, but they didn't have any anesthesia, antiseptics, that kind of stuff. I mean, it was just very, very little, and I'll get into more of that in just a minute. So anyway, the Marines there suffered from a lot of things, including some things that have a delayed effect, like beriberi, which is a vitamin deficiency that hits the muscle of the heart, and that was one of the things that got Dad. Okay, they had little or no medicines to speak of. The International Red Cross through the Swiss Embassy was very good about every 6 months or so arranging shipments of things into the camp. Unfortunately, they couldn't supervise the distribution of the materials after they delivered them to the camp. And the Japanese had a habit of they called it a rent. So they would pilfer sometimes 40% or more of whatever the shipment was, and they would hand pick, the good stuff. Okay, obviously. That applied to medicines, foods. Sometimes the food, it was a good effort. One time they had 600 pounds of meat delivered. However, it had to be divided between 1,200 men. So they got maybe what, a half a pound or so. So it was pretty sparse. Now, one of the few medicines that they had was sulfur powder, and sulfur powder is used medicinally, mostly externally for skin-related problems. Itching from poison oak, other skin itching kinds of issues is typically not used internally. But it does have some antifungal and antibacterial qualities to the sulfur. Okay? So that's important in this next story. They had a young Marine who was having a problem, and Dr. Foley became convinced that he had a ruptured appendix. And they needed to do something about it quickly. So they opened it and had no anesthesia. So this young Marine literally had to bite the bullet. He was. So they opened up his abdomen, and sure enough, so Dr. Foley sutured off the ruptured appendix. His abdomen was so filled with nasty stuff that Dr. Foley said, guys, just get as much of that out as you can and throw in a couple of handsful of sulfur powder and sew him up. Say a prayer. Well, the young man ended up surviving and did a 30-year career in the Marine Corps. Here's another drawing done by one of the prisoners that showed the kind of platforms that they slept on in the barracks. Most of the barracks had a wood floor down the aisle, but some of them had a dirt floor. These platforms had a slight angle to them, so they slept with their feet near the aisle and their head up, and there was a slight incline on the platform, and a shelf up behind each one of them where they could put personal things. So they have pretty rough living conditions. Open latrines. The one thing, those of you who are familiar with the Japanese latrines in the old days were open. You just squat and do your thing. However, the Japanese did hire local Chinese laborers or coolies to come in and clean out the honeypots every day. So the prisoners did not have to do that, but they had to live with the stench and the rest of it. Food consisted of basically 2 meals a day. They got a bowl of rice and a bowl of very watered down vegetable soup. It rarely had some meat in it. Once in a while it would have, sometimes have a little piece of fish, and the fish was usually squid. But the meals were pretty sparse. There were escape attempts. There was one Marine, Gerald Story. He was a corporal. Gerald Story, that made several attempts and several trips to Wardrow Jail. But he wasn't going to give up, and he finally made it. In the 1943 time frame, he made it. And what's interesting And what helped him that time was he had continued to learn more and more Chinese. So that when he encountered natives, and they were not real happy with the Japanese, so if he was lucky enough to not encounter any Japanese troops or anything, the Chinese natives would help him. And that's how he got down into in the old days we called it Indochina, French Indochina area, which is today what, Vietnam and Cambodia and all that kind of stuff. He got down there and connected up with some French troops and ended up coming home. Okay, so near the end of the war, they were packaged up in, that's a silly word, they were packed up in boxcars again and shipped by train out of the Shanghai area, out of the King One camp, and headed north. They had no idea where they were going. Now they ended up in Feng Tai, which is outside of the city of Peking. While they were en route, Feng Tai happened to be a big warehouse complex with pretty poor facilities to hold the number of men that were there, because by that time the 1,200 men in the camp was not unusual. While they en route to Feng Tai, at one of the stops, where they would let the guys get out and stretch their knees and have a potty break or whatever. 2 North China Marines, 2 Wake Island Marines, and 1 Flying Tiger pilot managed to escape, and they eventually connected up with one of Mao Zedong's communist units and found their way home. So here's what Feng Tai looked like. This also is a National Archives photo of unknown origin. And what's interesting, there's lots of books about this whole era of time. And if you want to look it up for some more reading. But there is a book written by a guy, and I think it's Serving Time with a Camera is the title. There's the word camera. He handmade a camera and had some incredible pictures. Now, it wouldn't surprise me that this photo came from some GI that had made a camera. They had access to some of the things that they needed. Dad said that they had a shortwave radio that wouldn't always work the way they wanted it to, but they knew when Roosevelt died, long before the Japanese told them that. And the parts for the radio had been pilfered out of the motor pool by the guys that were working in the motor pool, allegedly repairing the Japanese vehicles. Okay? So the origin of this particular photo is unknown, but is certainly telling. Now they spent 6 weeks here until the end of June. Okay, so let's review here a little bit. Okay, so there's Peking, Chinwantao, Sim, and in the blue line they came down to Wusong ports, moved over to King Wan, and then here in May were loaded on trains and sent back up and went to Feng Tai, and then in get the dates straight here. So here it is in 45. So the wars, the pincers were closing in on Japan. They left Feng Tai on June 26th, and by train, and arrived in Busan, Korea, at the tip of the Korean Peninsula, on July 1. And then were taken by ship from Busan over to a town, I'm not sure I can pronounce it, Shimon's Siki or something. And they arrived there by ship on the 3rd of July. That was 1945. By train, they were taken from there up to a town at the tip of the big island. There was a town there, Aomori. They arrived there July 4th. And then were taken by ship across this gap to the northern island of Hokkaido. And there was 3 camps that have been built there, 1, 2, and 3 Hakodate camps. The officers were in number 1, and the enlisted were divided between number 2 and number 3. What's interesting is this town, Aomori, which is right at the north end of there, reminder, August 6th was Hiroshima. The atom bomb was dropped in Hiroshima August 6th. The second bomb it ended up at Nagasaki. That's where the intended target was, that small town of Aomori. They wanted to do damage without killing people. But the weather would not allow them to do it. So they went to their alternate target of Nagasaki, which is down the coast. Certainly good for the guys because they would have had more fallout and probably a whole lot more damage because they were just across the channel on Hokkaido Island. Here's a picture of the camp that Dad was in on Hakodate, Yudashima 3. The senior officer in this camp was a Navy Lieutenant J.G. dentist. I, with a magnifying glass, I have looked high and low and can't see anything that I can recognize as Dad, but the rosters say he was there. Okay. Okay, so in quick succession here, the war ended August 24th. Almost immediately, they began to get airdrops, Americans bringing in airdrops of food and supplies, clothing, etc. And obviously they were able to get out of the camp and get to these drops that were out in the fields. They were actually rescued. It took them almost 3 weeks to finally have rescue troops come and get them. And they were rescued on September 14th. On the way home, Dad had stops in Guam, Honolulu, and Oakland, which is where the Okino Navy Hospital was at that time. And I'm sure that they were doing 2 things, checking the guys over, fattening them up a little bit before they sent them home. Dad arrived home on October 12th, 1945. He was 10 days away from his 41st birthday. And those guys served 1,380 days. Here's a picture of Dad's medic armband, which he made at home with. My oldest daughter is the caretaker of that now. She spent the majority of her career in and around the medical field, so she's taking care of Grandpa's. So there we are. If you would like, I'll have these out. These are things that I do have those in plastic, but you're certainly welcome to look at them, as well as the translation of the calendar items. Is there any questions or comments? There probably are. So, yes.
Did you stay in?
Yes, Dad put in 30 years. Yeah. Yeah, he retired in. Now, because of that beriberi and stuff, he did have a medical discharge. service-connected medical discharge. But he ended up passing away in 1965. So he had 20 good years at home, but he had not reached his 61st birthday yet, which is sad. But it's certainly rewarding to see or hear about the guys that live to be 100. Yeah. Yes, Liz. I can't hear you. Oh, the rape of Nanking. Okay. That was you can get more about it on the internet. As the Japanese were moving south towards Shanghai, and this would have been in the 39-40 time frame before the war started, they had some troops that just went wild in Nanking. And as the word suggests, I mean, there was the slaughtering of people. It was pretty bad. It was pretty bad. Over 300,000 dead just in the city of Nanking, which is sad. It really is. But that's what that is. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Did Jack retire as a chief?
Yeah, well, actually, he retired as a warrant officer, and here's why. He was due a promotion that, from a timing standpoint, that would have taken place while he was a POW. So because of time and grade and everything, if he hadn't been a POW, he'd have been promoted from first class to chief. Now, in those days, they didn't have the chief and the master chief and the super chief and all that kind of stuff. And the warrant officer ranking was available, but the Navy didn't use it like they do now. So when Dad got home, that picture right at the beginning shows him in his chief's uniform, his brand new one, and there was discussion about, well, if we promote you to the next rank that is available as an ensign, and you're not qualified to be an officer. So they said, what we'll do is we'll make sure you're always at the top of the chief pay grade, number one. Number two, they put this in writing in his file. When he retired, he would retire at warrant officer rank, which meant that he had officer privileges on the base and everything. So even after Dad passed away, Mom had an officer sticker on her windshield, and she loved it. The Marine Guards would salute her when she went drove through. That was new for Mom, I could tell you that. Any other questions? Wow. Yes.
I was at Marchfield last week, and we had the commemoration of the end of World War II, and there was a Japanese soldiers and Chinese soldiers, reenactment. And the Chinese soldier, he was Taiwanese, his parents are still in Taiwan. He was telling me that if we didn't get Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, kind of forced Chiang Kai-shek to deal with Mao, that they would have beaten the communists. But the nationalists would have beaten the communists. So I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Chiang Kai-shek was having a tough time hanging on. I mean, he certainly had a bigger organized group, but because of the Mao Zedong had these small groups that would run around and raid and like a little gnat kind of. Yeah. And the other thing that was going on was that there were regional warlords that were part of the culture of China at that time. It was diminishing in importance, but there would be warlords that would have control over an area. And the warlords didn't like Chiang Kai-shek because he was trying to organize the country and keep it together with a strong central government. And they didn't like the Mao Zedong, what they were representing. So these warlords, for a while, were kind of siding with the Japanese to fight their own citizens. So there was some weird stuff that went on for a few months until it all got sorted out. But I don't know that would necessarily be true. But I don't know that the U.S. forced Chiang Kai-shek Mao Zedong to work together, but I think that we told some support of Chiang at the wrong time, and after the war it was hard to reestablish a presence, if you will. Yes, Pat? Have I ever traveled over there? No, I did get to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia on business, but I have never been to China or Japan. My brother went to Korea as courtesy of the United States Marines. So he was able to see part of that. But, any other questions? Well, yes.
Your dad was over there as a prisoner. How much did you and your mom and your siblings know about what was going on?
Good question. We would get letters intermittently. The Swiss embassy did a lot of the in-between work on letters and packages. If you got onto that North China Marines website, you'll see some letters from some Marines that are displayed there. And one of them describes a birthday cake that he got months after his birthday. And needless to say, it wasn't edible, but he appreciated the thought that the mom and grandma and their folks back home had sent him a birthday cake. And so there was intermittent mail. We did get mail. We'd get cards. Once in a while, we'd get something from the Swiss embassy that they had chatted with Dad when they were delivering some supplies and etc. So it wasn't a steady stream of mail, but we did have contact. We knew where he was, and he would reinforce that with letters and cards. They were very limited on the amount of stuff they could write. But any further questions? Well, yes, that's okay.
The guy told me that in Taiwan, they have absolutely no worries about China attacking them. And I said, that's what the Ukrainians said too.
Yeah.
They were like so surprised that
Yeah.
they said, oh, they're just saber rat.
Yeah, good luck. Yeah, I don't know.
That's strange.
So, well, anyway, I hope you folks found this interesting and enjoyed it. Thank you.
How old were you when you came home?
He was 10 days short of his 41st birthday.
Oh,
Oh, how old was I? I was 8 years old, and that was when Dad climbed out of that Navy staff car on the night of October 12th. Was my first memory of Dad, because I was like 2.5 when he left. You know, he left in late 39, and so late 39, early 40, so I was barely a little over 2 years old.
Were you the youngest?
Yes, there was my older brother and then myself, just the two of us.
Great talking to you.